everyone, and welcome to Occupational Therapy 245, Introduction to Research Methodology, and today's lecture on the literature review process. My name is Melissa Kay. I'll be your instructor, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We have 5 objectives today to define literature review terminology, which I'll be introducing you to explain the lit review process, to investigate how to conduct a literature review, to practice identifying some of the parts of a research article, and we'll do this in class, and also to explore areas of interest for you and your research question, another thing that we'll be doing in class. As we go through the presentation, I encourage you to have downloaded or be looking at the presentation slide deck so that you can check out the presenter notes. There's a number of notes in there that will benefit you and expand on the knowledge that I'm going to share. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So there are a number of parts of a literature or research study article, or quote unquote a write-up, and where the lit review is going to come in is in the introduction, right? So we have an article, it's got intro, methods, results, discussion, limitations in future research, and implications for OT practice. And the lit review comes right in the introduction. Why would we write a literature review? Well, there's a number of different reasons. It identifies a research problem, so it brings attention to it. It clarifies the importance of a research problem, or RP. It also tells us about what is known about the topic. It identifies gaps in the knowledge base, in other words, that hole that I talked to you about last week. It provides examples of other literature and other studies on the topic of interest. It shows the importance of the problem, right? So we don't want to fall into a trap of researching problems that have no practical importance. And finally, it identifies or could identify theories or models that might be helpful. So let's start with research study terminology. There's a number of basic terms that are listed here, and we're going to go through them one at a time. They are research problem, problem statement, research questions, hypotheses, statement of purpose, and research aims or objectives. And I will say that as we go through these, there are definitions on this slide, but we're going to go through them one at a time. I'm going to give you some general examples, but I'm also starting a research study on resilience in children and families during the COVID pandemic. And so all of this is on my mind, and it's what I'm working on. So throughout this lecture, I'm also going to give you examples from this research study where I'm actually developing all of the information that you see here. And hopefully that kind of authentic approach to it will be helpful to you. All right, so the research problem. Research problem is something that is enigmatic, in other words, puzzling, perplexing, or troubling. And as I said, we're going to be using my research to kind of illustrate this. And so this will be the first part. And each of the slides, numbered 1 through 7, I believe, on these big bright slides will alert you to a different part of the research process. Okay, so before we go to the resilience example, we think about the research problem as a funnel, right? So there's a broad problem, then we narrow the topic down because a super broad topic we can't do anything about. We narrow it down, then we limit it further, and then we focus on a smaller topic that we can actually address with one study. And so it's this process of getting kind of a smaller and smaller view of what the problem is. Again, check out the presenter notes for more information. And I'm not going to keep telling you that. Just look at the slide deck, okay? All right. So, sources for finding research problems. And this is going to be the process that you follow as you start your journey through the literature review paper and process. You can look at literature, textbooks, quality improvement. You can read all of this stuff. There might be news that spurs a problem in your head, theory, talk to your classmates and your colleagues and to me, or experiences that you've actually had in work or in volunteering. So not all problems are created equal. We need to evaluate the problem, and I'll be helping you do that, and your classmates will as well, for its significance. Like, is it important? Can it be researched, right? Some things can't really be researched very easily, and so I'm going to steer you away from those. Also, how feasible is it to research this in terms of time, resources, ethics, cooperation from others, etc.? And how interesting is it to you? Now, there's a kind of a misconception that comes up in this class over and over. So I'll introduce it to you right now, which is you're writing the literature review, but think of yourself as a researcher who could actually be researching this problem. You are not doing a research study this semester, nor will you ever, during the course of your education, do a research study on this topic. So again, we're at that little beginning place of the literature review, but for the purposes of this process, you're going to be considered the researcher, and you're going to be looking at the whole thing as if you could conduct this hypothetical research study. So I hope that helps and makes sense. Okay, so every time there's my resilience study example, I will have a slide that is full of a picture and talks about resilience example, just to cue you. So everybody's been affected by COVID-19 to some extent, right? Young children are a group that have been particularly affected because for over 18 months, now almost 2 years, they're unable to go to preschool or connect with their peers, right? They've been at home, cooped up with their families who are typically trying to work. It's especially disturbing when we think about children developing through play and through connecting with other children and modeling. So these kids are losing the opportunity to build new skills. And typically, parents are not trained to be preschool teachers, and they have jobs to do, right? So during shelter in place, and even after the restrictions have been lessened, parents had to be workers, parents, caregivers, family members, spouses, and their children's teachers. So this is my research problem, that kids are not able to go through their childhood in a typical manner because of COVID, okay? All right, so we'll come back to this as we go through the slide deck. So the second piece of this process is the problem statement. A problem statement defines the gap between your desired goal and the current state of things. So it clarifies the nature, context, or significance of the problem. It's broad enough to include central concerns, but it's narrow enough to guide the study design. So again, I will be helping you to come up with these problems and also to size them appropriately so that they can actually be the topic for a research study or a hypothetical research study. When we write a problem statement, we identify the problem, we begin the statement with an ideal situation, describe the current gaps, state the consequences of the problem, and propose addressing the problem. There's a general example that has to do with exercise. So listen to this. After exercising, the human body is depleted of hydration and electrolytes from sweating. That's the context. The person then needs to decide how to best rehydrate the body and replenish the lost electrolytes. That's the issue and a possible solution. Not all beverages are equally beneficial after exercise. A coach, in this case, must decide what drink to offer volleyball players during a game or practice. So this is the relevance and the gap in knowledge. What drink is the best drink? Without drinking appropriate beverages, athletes cannot effectively rehydrate or maintain adequate electrolyte balance. So that's the consequences of the problem, right? If they don't drink the appropriate thing, they're not going to get replenished. In this experiment, we will investigate the electrolyte content found in standard sports drink compared to what is found in plain coconut water. So this is the proposed method for addressing the problem, is comparing two different solutions. All right. Now let's take my resilience study example, okay? So this is a draft. It's not the final version, but the COVID pandemic has disproportionately affected young children's growth and development, and the use of protective factors is vital for their well-being. For families who are from low-income backgrounds, who are from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds and family structures, and who have children who are experiencing developmental challenges like attachment issues or living in poverty, resilience is even more crucial yet difficult to access. Limited knowledge exists about what protective factors are the most useful for these families and how to enhance their resilience. Without nurturing protective factors and building resilience, this is the consequences, these children and their families will be at ever more disadvantage with regard to surviving the pandemic and thriving despite its evolving presence. In this pilot study, so now I'm introducing the possible solution, we will investigate the self-identified protective factors being used by this population with an aim to subsequently explore strategies for enhancing resilience. So that's my example. And we'll go over this in class, and we'll do it for your research problem. All right, so part 3, the research question, or in some instances, there will be more than one research question. Developing a research question. You need to ask yourself, what's interesting? What theoretical propositions are interesting? Which hypotheses are uninvestigated? In other words, what is the gap or the hole in knowledge? What are the gaps in the literature? And what issues are unresolved? So when we look at literature, what we're doing is we're looking at what exists, and what is missing. And the only way to find what's missing is to actually read those darn articles. So I'm going to get you in the habit of doing that and going to the section in the research articles that is about limitations and ideas for future research. Types of inquiry. So there's a lot of different kinds of questions or inquiry. And a very easy one to understand is, does X intervention work for Y population, right? It's very straightforward. So we might think about that, and that would be a treatment technique, but we might think about a treatment technique versus another treatment technique, right? So a comparison, which one works better, solutions to treatment problems, the nature of a phenomenon. So some people are not going to come up with treatment problems, but more so issues that affect a particular community or culture. I've had students do research projects on things like why do Latinx populations in the Western United States not access occupational therapy services as much as Caucasian folks. So that's not a treatment problem, but it's definitely a healthcare problem and an OT-based issue, and the nature of a phenomenon, right? And then also how to identify, clarify, or solve problems. So something about the process of OT. So here's a research question example, and it's a general one, and then we'll look at the one for the resilience study. All right, so if we were to describe or explore, we could say, what are the attitudes Asian American elders have towards falling? So it's nothing about how to solve it, it's just how do they feel about it, which is super helpful in subsequently addressing it, right? We could also seek to explain what is the relationship between fear of falling and incidence of falls in Asian American elders who live alone. So there we're correlating two things. Or we could predict potentially what is the cause of falls in Asian American elders who live alone. So notice that this is an important issue. It's OT related, but it's not necessarily related to a treatment protocol. There's all different kinds of questions, and many different kinds of questions are equally important to us as practitioners. So here's our resilience study example. In my study, what my research questions are, and there's 3 of them, are what are the protective factors that have helped children demonstrate resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic? The second one is what are the protective factors manifested in family relationships that have helped families demonstrate resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic? And then finally, what are the protective factors in educational, community, cultural, and societal contexts that have helped families demonstrate resilience during the COVID pandemic? So notice there's 3 questions. They're all about protective factors. In other words, the things that help maintain or build resilience, and they address different levels of the problem. So one is about kids directly, which we're super interested in. The other is the family relationships that help with protective factors. And the third is this more overarching, like what in the education, community, culture, society has helped families and children develop protective factors so that they're more resilient in the face of COVID. All right, you're about halfway through. So at this point, what I'm going to do is ask you to take a break, step away, stretch, get a drink of water, come back for the second half, okay? I said in the first lecture, and I'll say again here, that I used to cut my videos in parts, and it's great, but it's really time consuming. So I'm just going to encourage you to stop your playback, take a break, come back. I'll see you here soon. All right, welcome back. We are now on step 4 of the research process. I don't know why it's hard for me to talk, but here we go. Bear with me, okay? All right, so hypotheses. A hypothesis is a prediction about what's going to happen, right? A prediction among variables. It's what you hope to find. And research questions, or RQs, lead to your hypotheses. For research questions that are exploratory, there may not be a hypothesis. You just don't know what you'll find, and that's okay. Some things have not been explored enough to determine what you think you might find, and that's okay. All right, so using our general example, here's a hypothesis. The research question, or what are the attitudes of Asian American elders, what are the attitudes Asian American elders have towards falling? The hypothesis is that they perceive falling as a moral weakness. Now, you could see that if someone perceives it as a moral weakness, they're potentially not going to be really motivated to participate in an exercise program to increase strength and balance, right? Because they don't see it as a physical issue. So it would be super important to investigate this in order to then figure out what can we do about it. All right. Continuing with our example, RQ, what is the relationship of fear of falling and incidences of falls in Asian American elders who live alone? The hypothesis is that if you live alone, you have a greater risk of falling if you have a high fear level. Again, the implications are what's important. In our third example, what's the cause of falls in Asian American elders who live alone? And the hypothesis, we don't yet know what this, whether this is true or not, but we're hypothesizing that it is decreased balance resulting from a highly sedentary lifestyle. So we want to check that out, right? We want to see, is it that, or is it that it's a moral weakness, for example? So figuring out what the real cause is key. All right. In my resilience study, I don't have, we're starting with a pilot study that's just going to explore, and then we're going to do a lot of descriptive research before we even get to what are the protective factors. I've read about them. I think I know what they are, but I really don't know necessarily for sure. But for the sake of this example, I've come up with some hypotheses. And and I just realized that I didn't write any of them down on this slide. So the protective factors demonstrated by children and their families during the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say from my reading, include having a strong family structure. And I'm going to actually type these out so they're on your slide deck. Strong family structure, community supports, socioeconomic status that enables a safe house and neighborhood and outdoor spaces, etc. So you get the idea, yes? In my study, we really don't know. So I will keep you posted on that. But that may be hypotheses that would be indicated. And then we got to check it out. All right, statement of purpose, number 5. We're getting into the home stretch here. So a statement of purpose in a quantitative study identifies the study variables, the relationship amongst those variables, the population of interest, like who is it we're studying, and suggests the nature of the inquiry. To test, to compare, to evaluate are some of the verbs that might be used. A statement of purpose in a qualitative study identifies the central phenomenon. What are we looking at? Indicates the research tradition. So what type of research? There's a number of different types of qualitative research, which we'll be looking at as we dig into qualitative research. Does, again, talk about the group, community, or setting of interest, and then suggests the nature of inquiry. Again, some verbs to describe, discover, explore. In my study, I'll read you the statement of purpose. The purpose of the proposed research is to explore the factors that have assisted families with young children in developing resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, researchers are interested in families who are low income, have mental health conditions, and/or have children with developmental or attachment challenges. By exploring protective factors, which is a very particular term, that promote resilience, the researchers will discover how families coped or failed to cope during the pandemic. This information can then inform how professionals who work with children and their families might best assist them and enhance their ability to weather and thrive during this challenging time. So The statement of purpose, does all of those pieces that we just looked at, and suggests kind of a way forward. All right, then we have operational definitions. So an operational definition, and you will have these in your literature review, are a statement about how a concept is turned into a measurable component. The specific way in which a variable is measured in a particular study, and a definition of a term or a concept that might not be obvious. So we could measure, for example, we'll go to my example. We could measure resilience in a number of ways. In my study, resilience refers to the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten the viability, the function, or the development of that system. So I am defining resilience, and I'm also talking about how to measure it. I may need to talk more about how to measure it and what tools I'm going to use, but I say that the way that I want to measure it is how successfully would a child or a family adapt to disturbances in those dynamic systems. Another operational definition is protective factors, and these are characteristics associated with a lower likelihood of negative outcomes, or ones that reduce the risk factors input. Protective factors may be seen as positive countering events, and you can read more about it. Now, I didn't make these up. I found them in other literature. And so you're not going to make up definitions. What you're going to do is you're going to search for definitions that make sense within the context of your hypothetical study. All right, so the literature search. This is our last bit. Conducting a literature search, I actually think is really fascinating and kind of fun. It's like a treasure hunt. But for newer researchers, it can be a little frustrating. How do you know what key terms to use? How do you know where to go, which databases, all of that? So we're going to be working with our librarian. You want to brainstorm your idea. You want to keep careful records. So write down either on a note, hard copy or digital, what terms you've used, what your search led to. Just kind of keep track. You'll thank me for that, even though it feels like kind of a pain in the you-know-what while you're doing it. And then you slowly refine your search so that you get enough hits that you're sure that you've covered the topic in detail, but not so many that you can't actually investigate all those articles. And then you want to organize your hits in folders and using reference manager software. I don't care what type of software you use, but I think it's a really good idea to use a reference manager. I use Zotero, there's RefWorks, there's a whole bunch of them. So check them out. Part of it is what's free, part of it is what makes sense to you and kind of is you find easy and intuitive to use. They all work relatively well. But definitely do yourself a favor, download that so you can just throw all your articles into it and then easily find them again. And you can set up different folders for different classes and purposes. So you'll have all of your literature organized. It's really handy. Okay, so then we talk about databases or search engines, right? Nowadays, you can just go to the library website and type into OneSearch. That works great, but sometimes it doesn't pinpoint where you need to go quite enough. And so actually digging into particular search engines or databases is very important. And again, we're going to be working with our librarian, and she will be giving you some information about how to do that, what are likely sources for OT. And I also really encourage you to reach out to her if you're having trouble. That's what she's there for. And library science is an amazing field. And, with everything being digital, it's super much more easier than it ever has been to search, but it also can be overwhelming because there is so much available at like a few keystrokes, right? All right. So potential databases, I'm not going to go through them all, but keep this as a reference for yourself because these are places that tend to publish things that or compile articles that are useful to OT. And sometimes we need to go outside of OT to PT, nursing. Those would be two places. Sometimes to speech and language pathology or other healthcare professions to find things that will help us, even if they're not pinpointing what we want to know. Basics of searching, and we'll go through this. You want to identify the concepts from the idea or the research question, then combine search terms. And you may already know this. This is just a reminder for those of you that know, but we want to use limiters, right? And reduces the number of citations. So I say, I want to know about resilience and children. And I could even maybe say, and pandemic. Or I could use or, which is less restrictive. So I could say, I want to know about resilience and children or families, right? So the way that we put together the limiters can give us more or less hits and also capture some hits that we might not otherwise get. We want to restrict the dates, languages, and to use peer-reviewed journals only. So in the databases, you can choose several at one time, but once you're in those databases, you want to actually go through, it's usually on the left-hand side, you want to check off some of those things, restrict the dates. This is probably a good place to mention that in some cases, there's something called seminal articles, right? So the people who first came up with the idea, and it's really like super key. And even if it's old, we're going to use it. Otherwise, we're going to try to limit our search to the last 10 years. If you don't get hits over the last 10 years, you can expand a little bit. But in most research, it is seen as a little bit suspect if your literature is kind of old because it makes the reader think, what else has been done? Has this been disproven? Has it been reinforced? We just don't know. So do get in the habit of setting that limit to about 10 years. 5 is even better, but in there. And if you have questions, just ask me. Okay, so in looking ahead to writing the literature review, a literature review is a synthesis of information about a topic. Synthesis meaning pulling information from all different places and making sense of it for the reader. It's not a summary of articles. Now, it may seem like that a little bit, that you say, Brown and Schultz said this, and Rodriguez and Velasquez said this, and Green and McDonald said this. But that doesn't help us, right? So that linear view of it doesn't help, and it's not appropriate for a literature review. What you need to do is know your literature well enough so you can pull all the threads together and make an argument. And this argument is the need for the study ultimately, right? So you say, okay, all these folks did all this stuff and here's some details about it. And here's the need for the study. Now, we organize a literature review using headings. So I want you to become familiar with APA headings. They're very particular, and use them to help organize and transition your subtopics within your literature review. I also use, let's skip that for now. I also use sometimes concept maps or other kinds of visual models or Excel spreadsheets to help me organize my synthesis of the literature. But we can talk about that more when we get to it. All right, you made it through. Congratulations. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Just a reminder, please put together questions that you have about this lecture. Bring them to class. We will be discussing it, and we will be practicing all of the various parts of the process as we get your ideas about what you want to write a lit review on solidified, and you move into the literature review writing process, which again will be a series of small assignments that help you kind of scaffold your lit review. All right, everyone, have a great day. I'll see you in class. Thanks so much for your attention. Bye-bye.